Hello and welcome to the inaugural Why Philanthropy Matters Book Club book review. So as promised on my introductory video, I want to take a look at this book here, White Philanthropy, Carnegie Corporation's An American Dilemma and the Making of a White World Order by Maribel Morey. Now, I should say this is a little bit of a cheat on my part in that I have previously written a book review of this book for Alliance magazine, and I've also spoken to Maribel on the Philanthropisms podcast that I host. So I've had plenty of time to read the book, enjoy it very much, and to sort out my own thoughts on it. So I'm definitely not coming to this fresh. But my sort of overview of the book is I really like this book. I'm a big fan of the history of philanthropy anyway. And I think this book is a great example of the value of a historical perspective in informing current practice in philanthropy. And particularly what I really like about it is it does something that I think really good books on the history of philanthropy often do, which is take quite a specific story. So rather than setting themselves out very generally and looking at big pictures and themes to start with, they take a very specific story, dig into it in a really kind of rigorous way and bring some, proper academic history to bear on it. But in doing so, manage to draw out themes and ideas that then have much wider relevance. And I think this book is an absolutely great example of that. And a lot of what it says is hugely relevant to a lot of debates going on at the moment. So in a nutshell, the story in the book is essentially about the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the foundation entity established by Andrew Carnegie and obviously carried on after his death with an endowment. And it tells the story of the role that the Carnegie Corporation played in the genesis and subsequent funding and development of a project that led to a report known as An American Dilemma, written by the Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal, who subsequently won the Nobel Prize for Economics, or the Nobel Prize adjacent to economics, as a friend of mine would be very keen that I said, because there's no real Nobel Prize for economics. But this story is often told as one of the kind of great stories about progressive philanthropy driving forward an agenda on racial justice in the US. And the report in particular ended up being very influential because it was cited during the famous Brown versus Board of Education court case, Supreme Court case that eventually led to desegregation across the United States. But this book is fascinating in that it kind of complexifies that picture in a number of different ways. First of all, it makes it clear that the Carnegie Corporation was very far from being a passive funder of An American Dilemma. It's not something that Myrdal had come up with himself as a research project and then turned up looking for funding for. Rather, it was something that was started by Carnegie Corporation themselves, particularly two men who were at the helm of the organization at the time. The president of it, Frederick Keppel, and the chair, James Bertram. Both of whom had interacted with Carnegie himself, and I think in some interesting ways saw themselves as carrying on his legacy. And that legacy was one of wanting to engage with issues around race, but very much doing it from the point of view of seeing support for Black people and African Americans as being a means to an end of allowing them to have a better position in the world, but not one that ever put them on a par with white people. So there was a very definite element of racial hierarchy there. And also beyond that, Carnegie himself was interested in viewing white English speaking peoples as a coherent group across the world, as the book makes clear. So already Carnegie Corporation was very heavily tapped into a network of organizations that were interested in issues of what to do in post-colonial societies to ensure the interests often of kind of white minority groups in those countries. So coming out of this background, already it's sort of clear that the origin story for An American Dilemma is much murkier than perhaps it is sometimes presented. And this ties into another point in the book, which is that the scholarship around An American Dilemma that has largely been very sort of positive. Increasingly, I think that scholarship itself has become more complex and nuanced as a different range of voices have come in and that have questioned whether or not An American Dilemma is genuinely something that we should be that enthusiastic about, or whether actually all of its views about race are ones that that kind of see the role of black people as limited to some extent, and by promoting essentially an idea that forces them to assimilate themselves within white culture, rather than allowing space for a uniquely black culture that sits alongside that. And this is not a new idea. I mean, from the outset, there were critics who argued this, particularly, I mean, people like Marcus Garvey, also W.E.B. Du Bois, although he was quite quiet about this during his own lifetime and didn't speak out that openly, but subsequently, as his writings came to light, many of which are referenced in the book, it became clear that he felt very conflicted about an American dilemma. But thinking about the sort of particular relevance of this book to philanthropy, rather than sort of issues of racial policies in the US, which obviously in themselves are fascinating, I think two of the things that I found most interesting about the book are, firstly, that it really puts an emphasis on the role of philanthropoids rather than donors. I'm thinking here about the people who don't necessarily have the wealth themselves in the first place, but end up managing it on behalf of those wealthy people. So obviously the wealth here comes from Andrew Carnegie, but the key players in the story are, Carnegie's not one of them because he's dead by the time this happens. So the key players are people like Frederick Keppel and James Bertram. And I think in bringing that to light and making clear the amount of power that some of these often not very well-known figures have had, I think it forces us to evaluate what role philanthropoids play, at the moment in terms of current philanthropic practice, and how much power they wield and what sorts of responsibilities that brings. I think the other thing that I found really interesting, although it's by far, I should say these are not the only things that the book has to say, but I found fascinating, is it's a real example of the possibilities of using philanthropy in a very upstream way to fund things at a very early stage, when the end results will only be felt in a very diffuse way over very long time periods. So there was no way of knowing how influential an American dilemma would be, or how much value would be had from funding this one piece of work with this one Swedish academic. But actually, with the benefit of hindsight, you can see that it's had an enormous part to play in sort of shaping the parameters of discussions around race and racial policy in the US. And this reflects, I think, in some ways, some of the discussion around how successful conservative philanthropy in the US has been in sort of framing the battle of ideas, and in kind of shifting the Overton window on certain issues around what the acceptable parameters are. And something I know that lots of more progressive funders have been kind of soul-searching about how they could perhaps do that more effectively, with a view to the future around other issues, around things like racial justice and climate. So I think there's an enormous amount in the book around that that's really relevant and fascinating. So I would definitely recommend reading it. If you're interested, purely in the history of philanthropy and US philanthropy in the early 20th century, which is, a pretty key period in the sort of overall picture anyway. But also, if you're interested in some of the debates that are going on at the moment around the role of philanthropy in relation to issues of racial justice, I think this book provides an absolutely fascinating perspective. So do check it out, and we'll see you next time. Bye.